Welcome to the Center for Security Policy podcast. My name is Andrei Larionov. I'm a senior analyst for the center, and I have a privilege and honor to talk today with David Wurmster, senior analyst of the Center for Middle East Affairs. David has an illustrious career in the area of studying Middle East security, intelligence, geopolitics, history. It's impossible to cover all areas for which David made his contributions. Now, David is concentrating his attention on what is going on in Middle East. Recently, David returned back from his visit to the region, and we are using this unique opportunity to talk with one of the most thoughtful experts in the area on what is going on in Middle East, especially with Iran, Israel, and the United States. So, David, welcome to the show. Could you please let me start our conversation with a request to you? Could you provide, first of all, your so-called bird's eye view on what we are dealing with, what the United States is dealing, what Israel is dealing with in this region right now, at least for the last several years or maybe decades? Give us your general assessment. What is the essence, what is the nature of those events that attracted attention of the whole world?
Absolutely, Andre, and it's an honor to be with you here. And you too have an illustrious career, but so I'm really in a pleasure to talk with you. The 40,000-foot view, I think we really have to first of all step back and realize that Iran, Persia, Iran is really one of the most important countries in the region. It has been for 2.5 to 3,000 years. It really does represent the strategic balance of the region. I would argue even more so than Turkey, although Turkey obviously for the last 300-400 years has been a major strategic player. And then suddenly you have the rise of the resurrected Jewish state, Israel. And what you're really seeing is this ancient Persian culture fell to a government that declared war on Western civilization, really on civilization, in 1979. And it took a long time to transform the power and strategic position of Iran into the great regional power status that it now has, but for a negative purpose. So what you really see now culminating is this large uh, uh, conflict between the hijacked Persian nation, leveraged into a great regional power, against the representative of the West of Western civilization, really in some ways civilization, in that has arisen in the Middle East, Israel. And this is a proxy war, really, for a larger conflict between the West and anti-civilization, I'd really say, which back in '79 was conducted by the Soviet Union, but now has other players. But the bottom line is, this is not a new conflict. It is not a 12-day-old conflict. It is not even a conflict that goes back to October 7th. What we're seeing now is the direct culmination of the conflict that began in 1979 with the hijacking of Iran by the Islamic Revolution and the inevitable playing out of the twilight struggle between the ideology and the regime of Iran against Western civilization, represented in a local way by Israel, but really larger way by the whole Western alliance.
Dave, I think it's a very important point that you made right now, just underscoring that it is not 12 days war. It has been pronounced recently, and you were attracting and shifting attention of our watchers to the fact that this war has been launched at least in 1979 with appearance of new regime in Iran. So we'll come back to this so-called, what is the right title for this particular war. But let me ask you before, uh, you are talking about this new regime in Persia, new regime in Iran. Um, but historically, Iran and Israel had for a long time reasonably good relations. Sometimes people would call even some maybe friendly, or you would correct me, what would be the more appropriate term to use it. So what happened in 79? To what extent this is a let me try to use different approaches, whether it's a like an ethnic approach, Persian, or it's religious like Islamic, or sectarian like Shiite, or particular ideology of this particular regime that got the power in 1979, or something else, or combination of all these factors.
Well, I think it's a combination, not of all the factors, but most of the factors. I don't believe there's an ethnic issue there, and I can go back to that in a second. As far as religious, it is Shiite in part. The Shiism, first of all, it's Islamic. Islam has been relatively hostile to Judaism from its inception, and seen, in particular, the Jews, seen already in its early period the Jewish Persian connection is a hostile threat to the Islamic project, and that goes back to its early days in part, and in some ways describes the particular anger that Muhammad himself had toward specific Jewish tribes, which had been traditionally aligned with the Persian Empire. So there's an Islamic veneer, then there's a Shiite veneer, which also has this idea of purity, and the Jews are impure, some of it derived from Islam. And then there's a third characteristic to the Iranian regime, which is really a third worldism. It's it's a uh, it's a non-aligned movement derivative of the Cold War, and that had a particular anger at Israel. The Shiite aspect, for example, doesn't cover Jerusalem. Al-Quds force, Al-Quds is the word for Jerusalem for the Muslims in Arabic. It comes from Kadosh, actually, from Hebrew, holy. But nevertheless, Al-Quds is how they refer to Jerusalem. For the Shiites, Jerusalem was never particularly holy. So you see this sort of attempt to appeal to the Sunni world by this Shiite regime, but also kind of an attempt to appeal to third worldism, the non-aligned movement, the old KGB aligned structures, the ones that the PLO created. So three of those four categories, you really see hostility. But in many ways, all three of those categories are aberrant or aberrations from the ethnic question. If you look at the end of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, it ends with praising Cyrus. Why? Because Cyrus had essentially taken the Jewish people, brought them back from the Babylonian exile, put them back into the land of Israel, funded the reconstruction of the temple, and politically and strategically helped them. Why did it do it? For two reasons. One is they understood that Egypt was the nemesis, uh, and Israel, the Jewish people, were a buffer. So it was really the frontline strategic buffer of the Persian Empire against Egypt. Unfortunately for the Persia, Egypt was a declining empire. The empire rising was the Hellenic Empire, the Greek Empire. And they had problems there, but nonetheless, and the Jewish world kind of straddled the Greek Empire and the Persian Empire. So there were elements of both, partly reflected even in the Talmud. There's a Babylonian Talmud, which is really Persian oriented, and then the Jerusalem Talmud, which is more Hellenic, but which are both valid, by the way, in Judaism. So you see how the Jews had these integral strategic relationships with the Persian Empire. These continued all the way through. You saw when there was a major Jewish revolt in what is today Medina, as in Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, there were powerful Jewish tribes there. And at one point, about 100 years before Muhammad, they revolted and actually became independent. And they instantly appealed to the Persian Empire for assistance. Why? Because the Abyssinian and Greek the Byzantine Empire and the Abyssinians saw this as a threat from Persia, and therefore they moved up strategically in a pincher and crushed this Jewish revolt. And the Persian Empire, exhausted from its wars with Byzantium, didn't really help. But you can see this constant return to Jewish Persian relations. In the modern era, Ben Gurion, when he created, when he was the first prime minister and was tasked with trying to create this new national ethos, his belief was that Jews had been so devastated, so distorted, and corrupted by 2,000 years of exile and disempowerment, that they were a damaged soul. So he looked to Persian nationalism as a model for helping infuse Israel with a new national ethos. And he actually went to the Persians, to the Shah at the time, and he suggested, partly out of selfish reasons, because he wanted to have this reflect on Israel, is to resurrect Persepolis and to have a major archaeological site developed there in order that it would reinforce this idea that the Persians and Persian nationalism and Persian identity is integrally linked with the Jewish identity, and the Jewish people can look toward Iran and see it as a model. So this idea that Jews and Persians are enemies are it's just not true. Even the story of Purim, where you had Esther and Mordecai with the Persian emperor Artaxerxes, one has to remember that it was the royal line was married with Esther, and the sons were then therefore descendants both of the Jews and of the Persians. And this is the royal line of Iran under the Achaemenid dynasty. So you have this integral link civilizationally between the two. And that's why I say the three Islamic elements or modern non-aligned movement element and the Persian element are actually in tension with one another.
I think it's very important what you are saying right now, that even this very short sketch of the 2,500 history showing that there is nothing that would prevent potential possible reconciliation between Israelis and Persians. And what we can see over the last 46 years from 1979 looks like is deviation, more deviation rather than the rule. So that is why what we know from history and from all this background of both nations, that it tends to have a more in common rather than in opposite. So since this 1979, with all this background, with all these factors that influenced, nevertheless, this is a new regime that appeared in Tehran, in Iran, that introduced a new, I would say, not so much religion, but certainly no new ideology, new political program, new political platform. Could you describe the most important, essential part of this program towards Israel and towards the United States? That these new people who, as we know, some of them came from Paris before landing in Tehran. Nevertheless, they happen to be in Tehran and they proclaimed their goals. What are they?
Well, it's a complex regime, but there are two pillars to it, or two parts to it. The first one is the Valyat Faqih, which is the rule of the jurisprudent. For those who study philosophy, they'll recognize that as a religious version of Plato's philosopher king. And what it is that, in Shiite Islam, 12er Shiite Islam, the 12th Imam disappeared, will eventually come back. He's in occultation, he didn't die. And the Shiite world is in quiescent passivity, waiting for his return to be re-empowered. Now, the idea was that he'll imminently come back, so there is no replacement. There is no caliph. Caliph literally is the Semitic root word for replacement. So there is no replacement or deputy or caliph that replaces the 12th Imam. They're waiting for the 12th Imam to come back. And it was perfectly fine for the Shiite world to live this way for 1,000 years because they also lost the majority control of the Muslim world. They were a minority. They were living disempowered without any real authority. And as a result, having an ideology of an eventual return of an imam that then rules over them and has political power was suitable to have that ideology that eventually they'll have the majority rule again. Eventually they'll be in control of their own lives, but for the moment they're not. So as the imam is in occultation, so too is the Shiite world in a minority status and in a quiescent status. The problem with that was Iran. Because there you had, after the Safavid dynasty, about in the 1500s, you had Shiite Islam begin to wed with political power, which put an inherent tension on this idea. And it arose the idea over time that there should be somebody who speaks with the occulted imam, who has the voice of the occulted imam and the spirit of the occulted imam, and serves as his deputy, his caliph essentially, for the period of time until the occulted imam returns. So there arose slowly this concept, and it's the ultimate irony that it's a Hellenic concept, again in Persia, of the introduction of the philosopher king, the king in this case being the key jurisprudent, and
Hmm.
rule of the jurisprudent. And he is, in essence, speaking for the 12th Imam. This is Shia Islam wedded to power, which
Hmm.
went against traditional Islam. Now, how does this apply to Israel? The second pillar is the return of the Mahdi. And what is the philosophy of that? There was a lot of borrowing from Sunni Islam, a lot of belief that the Mahdi will only return when there is purity of faith and that the great war with the non-Muslim world will take place, and the so to speak, what we would identify as the Antichrist would return in disguised form as some sort of false prophet, false Messiah, and the Muslim world would be in a great war. And in that great war, it would bring about the return of the Mahdi. It would bring about the resurrection of Shia Islam as the pure Islam, and so forth. And you have a pillar of the Iranian regime, the Mahdists, which believe in the imminent return, that he's about to come back now, and that if they show their faith, if they show how faithful they are, then it will precipitate his return. And that crowd is mostly residing in the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they are the posse. They are the real foundation of the unique militia, essentially, that Ayatollah Khamenei has. That's different from what Khomeini had. Khomeini was the rational school of Aliyat al-Faqih, and they really didn't like these Mahdists. But these guys, they really believe in the imminent return. So they believe in this apocalyptic war with Israel, or with the West as a whole, of which Israel is part. Khomeini, his hatred of Israel was partly Islamic, the illegitimacy of Islamic trust territory having been reverted to non-Islamic rule, and second of all, a third worldism, which was derived to some extent from his KGB orientation. You know, when you had the PLO in the late 60s started cultivating these Shiite revolutionaries in Lebanon, they also included Shiite Persian revolutionaries. So in many ways, you started seeing the birth of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in Beirut in the late 60s, not 70s, during the Shiite awakening, already in the 60s under the tutelage of the PLO. And from that, the regime derived a very strong third world, non-aligned movement, PLO type, Yasser Arafat PLO type strategic view of the world. So you see, one was at war with Israel for those reasons, and this crowd that really rules Iran now is also for apocalyptic reasons at war with Israel. And I think that has a serious implication on how far Iran is willing to go in its confrontation with the West.
Dave, I have a suspicion that probably some of the people who watch our program will think, okay, that's very interesting. All these historic roots, all this cultural basis, all this ideology, but what all of this has with the reality? Because we are people of modernity. We are in the 21st century, or even just in the 20th century, the end of the 20th century. Why all these medieval concepts are relevant for us or for even people in the Middle East, because they are also people are either already in modernity or moving to modernity. Uh, do we have any confirmation that these concepts, some of them would be rather alien for many of our friends, colleagues who watch this video would say, okay, is it relevant? It's maybe for a few freaks in mosques, but the just majority of people, even Iran, would not be captured by these strange ideas. Is there any confirmation of transformation of these ideas in real policies of Iranian regime?
Yeah, you touched on a number of things. One is the real policies, and two is the Iranian people. Let me start with the real policies. Yes, we see tremendous impact of these apocalyptic ideas on policy. I'll give you a couple examples. One is Soleimani. When right before Soleimani was killed, the United States had a drone shot down in the Persian Gulf. And in the last minute, President Trump called off the attack. This is back in 2019. Yes, 2019. He called off the attack, a retaliatory attack on Iran. And the Iranians then started escalating their war against the United States. And there were definitely voices in Iran that said, be careful. The United States is powerful and they're dangerous, and Trump himself could be dangerous. So perhaps we should go a little easy. We can tweak, we can push, but it's better to have this relentless long-term pressure succeed than push it over the edge into a major confrontation, sort of an apocalyptic confrontation. And instantly, when a few clerics from Qom, which is, quote, the more rational school, more Khomeini oriented, Valiyat Faqih, when they said that, then you started seeing billboards appear in Tehran with Soleimani portraying the role of Moses in the Islamic context, leading the people of Israel, which is interesting that they did there say there was a people of Israel, leading them out of Egypt, out of Pharaoh, slavery. And all the generals surrounding Moses started saying, well, you led us to the desert. Now we have the sea in front of us. All these Egyptians are coming. They're going to slaughter us. Maybe we should negotiate with the Pharaoh. Maybe we should give in to the Pharaoh. And there was Soleimani, the image of Soleimani as Moses saying, you lack faith. It is a test of your will. It is a test of your faith. And it will not, and when the Mahdi returns, you will not be part of the armies of the faithful if you persist in these doubts about the delivery of victory by Allah. Now, where practically does that lead us now? President Trump wanted a ceasefire after 12 days of war with Iran because he believed the Iranian regime had been so damaged, so wounded, stripped of its nuclear program by Israel's attacks and then the American bombing run, that there was really nothing left for the Iranian regime to fall back on, and they had to come to terms with America. Otherwise, they knew that they would be continually hit and they would fall. It was a hopeless war for Iran and its regime. And President Trump felt there was no alternative for the Iranian regime, and therefore they would eventually now, with what has happened, come to an agreement. What I believe the president didn't understand is this concept of the ultimate battle and the Mahdist idea that the more difficult the war becomes, the more hopeless the position is of the Muslim armies, the more it is a test of faith. And the more you have to retreat into absolute faith and and assume that Allah will deliver you the victory over the enemy, which on paper and in reality is much more powerful. But Allah trumps all. So therefore, this is a test of faith. And they go back to the Quran, the battle of the trenches, which is again against Jewish tribes in part. It's against the elites of Mecca who were attacking the Mohammedan army in Medina. The Jewish tribes said, "You're crazy. You're going to get slaughtered," and they sided with the Meccans. And Muhammad basically said at that point, "You have no faith. We will deal with you later," which then led to the slaughter of the Jews in Khaybar. But the idea was the worse it gets for the Muslims, the more it is a test of the purity of your faith, and the less you can concede, and that you welcome the setback because it gives you the opportunity to weed out those who don't truly share the faith. If you think of it that way, then President Trump's assumption that the Iranian regime will see reality and will see that it's hopeless and begin to negotiate a concession and an exit, the Iranian regime sees the opposite. It sees it as an opportunity to assert its faithfulness.
We shall come back in a second to President Trump understanding of this situation, but just let's spend a little bit just to the topic that you mentioned, ultimate goal of the regime. What is ultimate goal? Just let's imagine that they have these all chances, all power to execute what they are planning. You mentioned nuclear program, that is already just in the passive what happened to the program recently, but just let's go to the beginning. Why this program appeared in Iran? What was the purpose of building this program? What is the purpose of missile program? What is the purpose of building access and maybe some other elements of that platform that has been created back then 25, 26 years ago? What was the ultimate goal towards Israel, towards United States, and towards Arab neighbors?
The ultimate goal is, and they've said so since 1979, is the destruction of the non-Islamic world and the spreading of the Islamic revolution globally. They have global ambition. This isn't just regional power, local power, or even anti-American. It is a global aspiration to finally install the global Islamic revolution. You've had even such, quote, moderates as Ali Larijani said this. He warned London in 2006. He said, London, you should convert now because eventually we will come to you and you will be converted, but you will not get as good a terms when you convert then as now. It'll be with the sword then. Now you can do it voluntarily, and there'll be great benefits to you to do that. So they had their sights in 2006 verbally, clearly by somebody we in the West considered a moderate, saying you will convert in the end to Islam. So then you go backwards. Everything else is tactics. It's how they get there. It's means to get there. The great Satan, the United States, Israel's the little Satan because it's the representative of the United States. The great Satan is the great Satan, not because it's the only enemy, but because they understood the power of the United States was the power they had to overcome, first and foremost, to destroy Western civilization and install a global revolution. The second one was more defensive. The appeal of American culture, Western culture as a whole, the whole post-World War II Western world, was such an appeal to the Muslim world that it was also, they saw that as, that's also why the United States was the great Satan. Satan in Islam is a tempter. It's a temptress. It seduces you. It isn't this agent that manipulates you like a puppeteer. It is a seducer. And this is what Western culture, represented by the United States, represented. It was seducing the Muslim world away from Islam. So for them, the great Satan was the first and foremost and really the ball game enemy that had to be overcome and destroyed. But it went beyond that. Once you destroy the United States, then the path is clear to global revolution.
I think very important point that you made, that the goal is not only destruction of Israel per se and expulsion of Jewish people from the territory of Israel, if I understand correctly what you're saying and what is been described by this program, but also Islamization of London and probably some other European cities, which is being possible. It could be possible with heavy blow to the United States. And the most important one that just we talked about these medieval roots of the movement, but there is a very modern challenge, this seduction of US and the whole Western civilization to people of third world and of Islamic nations that they do see reality. They have they can compare what they have in their countries and what has been achieved by countries belonging to the Western civilization. So that is why it is to some extent very modern um, uh, movement, because it's a reaction, it is a response for real competition from successful nations belonging to the Western civilization.
Yes. You actually, this is where the Persian element comes in. It's a tactic. I mean, it's not, again, the goals, as I said, were part Islamic, part third worldism. And there is no ethnic reason why Persia hates the West. Um, but the strategy, the strategic culture of Iran is very Persian. And why do I say that? The epic story of Persia is what has now been, to some extent, usurped by the Arab world, but it's 1001 Nights, the story of Sherazade. And
Mm-hmm.
the bottom line of the Sherazade cycle of stories is here is a woman, the epic symbol of powerlessness, a person who has absolutely no power, the lowest rung of human society, a woman, is marrying a king who has absolute power, the highest rung of power in society.
Mm-hmm.
And he is going to execute her the next morning. And so she tells these stories in order to buy time. But, that's not a strategy. You buy time, you buy time. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of a story, or you're going to be too sick to tell a story, and then you're executed. The purpose of the cycle of stories was for Sherazade to begin to burrow into the soul of the king, King Shahryar, and begin to slowly grip, take over, and then manipulate the soul of the king. At the end of the story, Sherazade becomes more powerful than the king himself because the king is just manipulated. She's the puppet master of the king at that.
Mm-hmm.
This is the epic strategy of Persia. By the way, in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible, you see a very early and very two-dimensional version of it in the story of Esther and Mordecai and King
Mm-hmm.
Artaxerxes in the book of Esther. But this is Iranian strategy. It's how do you manipulate the soul of your enemy to take over his power and turn it against him, rather than a confront. So they're very realistic. They see all the aircraft carriers. That doesn't impress them. No amount of power impresses them, as the power of the king Shahryar did not impress Sherazade. Even
Mm-hmm.
using power doesn't impress them because it doesn't reflect the manipulative capability to master your opponent. So they knew they could just wait it out. Even if you're willing to use power, they're willing to wait it out. And that's why the Iranian regime still has confidence. It believes that it can still manipulate Western soul in such a way that it takes it over and forces its own self-destruction. That's its strategy.
That's great. Is there any instrument exists that can be used against this strategy? What can be used to win over this particular strategy, because it's a very consistent, very persistent, and very deep-rooted strategy, which cannot be distracted by many factors that you've mentioned. So,
There are three. The first is the Iranian people themselves, because they
mhm,
themselves are not in tune with their government. They generally don't like their government. They understand what their government's doing. And they're Persian, obviously, so they understand the strategy, but they believe this government more and more is an alien intrusion imposed on them. In many ways, Iranians are becoming de-Islamified mentally. They see this government as a strange, distorted Islamic imposition on their great civilization, their country. So, one, you have the alliance on some level of the Iranian people. The second thing you have is that the strategy of manipulation has one huge vulnerability, and it's a vulnerability the Israelis now tapped into. You've heard even President Trump said he didn't quite expect Israel to go it alone. They certainly, the Iranian regime did not expect Israel to do this. I think the world was quite surprised, both with what Israel did and when it did it, and that it did it alone. The reason for that is if you have a manipulative strategy, you need to be able to predict your enemy. You need to know what he wants. You need
Mhm.
to get into his soul, understand it, and then veer it off into your direction in a manipulated way. But what happens if your enemy's crazy? There's this thing called the jinn, the genies. This mystical figure you have in Persian and Middle Eastern lore. If the genies take over your body, that's called janana. And a guy who has the genies overtaken you is a
Mhm.
majnun. The Majnun is the image of the person you most fear in the Middle East. Why? Because he's crazy. The jinn have taken him over. He's unpredictable. You can't get into his soul because he doesn't have control of his soul anymore. He's a Majnun. So the even in Persian culture, the Majnun, you just let him be. You just walk away. There's no way you're going to win against that guy because you cannot manipulate him. Israel suddenly emerged as the Majnun.
Mhm.
They could not figure out how Israel suddenly did all this. And you see it. You see major clerics in Iran right now saying that it's very difficult to cope with the Israelis. The failure of the air defense system was such because the jinn took it over. They see the jinn, the genies, as a major factor in this defeat that they've just suffered. And that terrifies them. They're terrified of Israel. They don't know what to do. They can't win against Israel in their mind, except for one thing, which is to try to get the United States to shackle, to contain, to put Israel in a box. And this gets to the America can't be the Majnun. They can't be crazy, although Trump has this image a little bit in Iran, but it's America's a big country with many other factors and so forth. But America has something else, which it did in World War II. I mean, at the end of the day, the regime really relies on the survival of Khamenei. He holds together the old Valiyat Faqih crowd and the Mahadist crowd, so many different groups that manifest the Iranian regime converge on the figure of Khamenei. And if he is killed, you will see the system unraveling and internecine fighting and collapse. And once you have the internecine fighting, they will start reaching out to the outside to help bring it in to fight the other enemy on the inside. And then the whole system just implodes and collapses. I believe Israel was almost there. And I believe Israel was intending on killing Khamenei and knew that they had where he was and were about to do it the day the ceasefire took effect. And it was really the United States decided that that's a bad idea and didn't want that to happen. But the Israelis almost went for that last strategy against this sort of a manipulative Sherazade 1001 Nights strategy, which is just kill them, kill the leadership and cause the system to implode. So those are the three methods you can fight against it. But again, the United States in the last moment, first of all, restrained Israel and put it in a box, according to the Iranians, and two, pulled the plug on that third strategy.
So first of all, Israel turned out to be Majnun for
Yes.
Iranian regime.
Yes.
Do you just I will put a couple of questions just in a row. So did it happen by accident or as a result of particular strategies that have been developed by Israelis for not some time, and they expected or at least wanted to achieve something like that? Uh, s-
I heard enough discussions in Israel, popularly on news programs and among government officials in the year or two before this, or in the period following the October 7th war. I heard two things, which was one, Israel has to stop speaking Western and speak Middle Eastern, as they put it, to speak Ma'aravit is Western and Aravit is Arabic. So Israel needs to learn how to speak Arabic and not Western. That was one thing, which is implying that already. But then I heard very specific, very not illusions, but straight out, we have to be a Majnun, quote, we have to be a Majnun. We have to be crazy. We have to show the Iranians we're crazy. And there are enough Persians in Israel, Persianese Jews, who understand this as well. And I know some of them were speaking to the prime minister. So I have a feeling that this was a far more conscious projection of power, much more, both in terms of doing the act and how it was done, was deliberately unpredictable in order to terrify the regime in Iran.
I would use even term, let's say, orientalization of foreign policy and defensive policy and security policy on the part of Israel on purpose,
Correct.
just to understand better the enemy and to just itself or Israel itself, what would be the best way to respond to all these threats. And it looks like when Israel applied these instruments, so they produce quite impressive results.
Yes. And it would have, I think, if the war had gone on another 3, 4 days, uh, I think we might have seen the end of the Iranian regime. Now, if this continues, I'm sure the Israelis continue to work behind the scenes to undo the Iranian regime, and they have some capabilities to do so. But I also think the war is not over. I think the ceasefire was based on assumptions that were flawed by the United States. And as a result, I believe that you're going to see in the next few weeks and months a resumption of this war, and then Israel will finish the job.
It brought our conversation to a very important point. So just you mentioned, first of all, this potential assassination of Khamenei, and we've heard many rumors and leaks and comment that it is not excluded prior to June 22nd. And a number of Israeli people, as well as not only Israeli experts around the world, were talking that it's a matter of time, matter of days, or just it's kind of that's a possibility. And just also Prime Minister Netanyahu went to Iranian opposition TV show, itself entitled Regime Change in Iran, during which he joked that nobody had predicted the collapse of the USSR or the Assad regime in Syria before both of them occurred. So does it say us that Israel, in this strategy that has been developed over some time and been implemented, at least from June 13, from the launch of Operation Rising Lion, certainly with a lot of preparations prior to that, just moving persistently to undermine the basis of the regime. Certainly, it's up to Iranian people to decide, but at least they were trying. I mean, Israelis were trying to do everything possible to make it possible to help to assist Iranian people to do what can be done by themselves.
Exactly. I think what you see here is that Israel, while its initial objectives were practical, to eliminate the threat for several years or a decade from the nuclear program, from the missile program, and to culminate the October 7th war with the final destruction of the Ring of Fire by throwing the Iranian regime into an extremely difficult position. But as the success happened, deep down, the Israelis knew ever since October 7th, and there's evidence of that when Prime Minister Netanyahu, within the first days after October 7th, this war begins in Gaza, but it will end in Tehran, is what he said. Uh, there was an understanding that sooner or later, this will result in a direct Israeli-Iranian confrontation from which only one nation's regime will emerge, or one nation will emerge. Either Israel will be destroyed or the Iranian regime will be destroyed. Interestingly, the way Prime Minister Netanyahu phrased it, he put the Israeli nation and the Iranian people as allies against the Iranian regime. So that's the battle line in the Israeli mindset. It isn't Israel versus Iran. It is Israel and the Iranian people versus an artificial Iranian regime that is inherently, therefore, weaker and more easy to overcome on some level than were it really a genuine expression of Iranian nationalism. I think that's the divide with the United States. We have two misconceptions, I believe. One is that in some way the Iranian regime is a genuine expression of Iranian national sentiment arising from the Mossadegh coup in 1953, all of which I think is reliant on false history and propaganda that the Iranian regime has put forward. I don't think that's real. The second idea is that if you have a collapse of the regime, like with Iraq, you have chaos, and America will be drawn in, and nation building, and Americans will be killed, and the Iranian people will resent and hate America. And in general, because Israel destroyed the regime, everybody will hate Israel, and everybody will hate America as Israel's ally. And we will be in a miserable circumstance that eventually could bring in China, Russia, and so forth. I think all that led President Trump to make in my view, a premature push for the ceasefire because he could have had, I think, along on the back of Israel's actions, a tremendous victory that reverses the strategic threat Iran posed since 1979 with the destruction of the regime. Instead, I think what he thought was he'd be able to manage the conflict. And what he'll find out is that the Iran is not manageable, and that they're apocalyptic, and that they will keep going, and they will keep trying to kill him. They will keep acting against Israel. They will not behave, so to speak. So I think he will eventually come around to the idea that, there's no dealing with these guys. And he'll come around to the Israeli point of view that the only way you get to a ceasefire, let alone peace in the long run, is over the Iranian regime. You need to get through it and around the other end without it. And so I do think you're going to see a strategic shift, and that will, I hope, happen fairly soon. My my assumption is we're talking weeks and months, not years.
Mhm. Um, what is really striking in the analysis of the last several weeks that prior to all these events, when Israel or United States or combined West was dealing with such or similar regimes, so it was very clear that the leader of the regime is one of the critical elements for sustainability and survivability of such a regime. We've seen what Israel did with Sinwar, and
Yeah.
that's the kind of the beginning of collapsing and disintegration. Not final yet, but nevertheless, very serious blow to Hamas. We've seen what happened to Hezbollah after elimination of Nasrallah. We've seen that Libyan regime after Gaddafi assassination disintegrated. We've seen what happened with Iraq regime after assassination, as kind of catching Saddam, and after that his elimination. We've seen it many times in other Middle Eastern countries with the same result. The number one person is a critical element for stability of the regime. And now the question arises, why President Trump intervened in that business, and looks like Israel was on the way there, and frankly speaking, saved Ayatollah. And President Trump even just put a tweet in which he congratulates himself with saving the number one of that person, and meaning saving the regime. So that regime that produces the deadly threat to Israel, to the United States, to the Western civilization, and even personally to President Trump.
I think there are several factors, some of which are intertwined. They're not either or, and some of them are related to one another. First of all is the domestic political, whether it's Steve Bannon or Tucker Carlson. The immense push against the president was If you let Israel do this, let alone if you engage and bomb Iran, it will be an endless war. Thousands of Americans will be killed. And worse, Russia and China will intervene, and you won't be able to get out of it. And let's say you get lucky and you bring down the regime, that's even worse because then there's chaos, and America will have to go in like we did with Iraq. And then we will have to manage Iran, and we will have an endless war again, managing Iran, nation building, draining America. And then the memory of the Iraq war predominates. That's the domestic thing. So the President Trump, I thought, wanted to shut that down by shutting down the war. He did what he did to take away the nuclear program, stop the war, prevent that from happening, leave the Iranian regime in place. The second thing is, I think there's an important role here that needs to be examined of Putin. The day before the ceasefire was announced, there was a conversation between President Trump and Putin. And it's quite possible that there was a convincing going on of President Trump that there are dangers to continuing the war, but moreover, there are benefits to stopping it then. It's possible Putin may have said, listen, I have currency with the Iranian regime, they're our ally. We first of all don't want them to go down, but second of all, we can convince them of things, and we have some sort of a tacit agreement from them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there might have been some influence by Putin in convincing Trump that there is a diplomatic path forward, that the Iranian regime is capable now and willing to sign the sort of denuclearization deal that President Trump was after to begin with. And obviously that didn't happen, and I don't believe it will happen. I don't believe the Iranian regime will ever give up its nuclear program. But that doesn't mean that Putin didn't convince President Trump of that. And I think part of it was to save the Iranian regime. That it was Putin's attempt to save his ally by promising President Trump something that wouldn't happen. And then second of all, President Trump was willing to believe it because he didn't want to bring down the Iranian regime. So I think that there was sort of a We talked about Iran's manipulation. You know, the KGB, the Soviet Empire, had also developed fairly good skills in manipulation, information warfare, and playing on the perceptions of one's enemy quite effectively. And I think Putin is a very adept thinker in that way, and he surrounded himself by people like Dugin and others who are very adept in thinking these ways. So in some ways, I mean, I hate to put it, but Putin served as the Rasputin for Trump for that moment, and I think led him into a deal that the president himself will soon regret.
I think you touch very important and, frankly speaking, rather painful topic, because it's indeed there was a telephone conversation between Putin and Trump, and this is a rare case when Putin called Trump, not vice versa, on June 14th. And from the report that Putin assistant put on that site, it was very clear that they talked about first, no elimination of Khamenei, no regime change in Iran. This is Israel-Iran war. Actually, in Putin's words, it's an Israel aggression against Iran. It's not Iranian-Israeli war started in 1979. It is Israeli aggression
And
against Iran.
therefore, the name the 12-day war, because
Exactly.
12 days were the day it started between Israel and Iran directly, whereas the war really started 2 years earlier and 46 years earlier.
This is direct borrowing from Putin that
Right.
Trump has spread around the world, not probably thinking too much about what he's taking and from whom he's taking and what is the purpose of this borrowing. So what is also important, it is important that that's a very rare case, maybe unique case, when the Kremlin website has published the date after which they, meaning Putin and Trump, would move to another topic in bilateral relations. So now they're talking about Iran, Israel, Iran, and this is a June 22nd. This is a rare, once again, maybe unique case. It's not a ceremonial date, it's not a holiday, it's not like May 8th or May 9th or September 1st or something, really very important historical date. It's some kind of June 22nd. All of a sudden, but it's coincidence that B2 used their payload on June 22nd against Iranian positions with nuclear program. So what also important that on June 14th they were talking over phone, and it appeared that the final decision to send B2 to Iran has been taken by Trump on June 15th, next day after his telephone conversation with Putin, because fuel tankers, US fuel tankers, flew to Middle East and to Mediterranean to support, as has been claimed by Israeli operations, but essentially helping and supporting B2 travel for 18,000 miles to Iran and back on June 16. So, and after that, as we also seen, Putin express his deepest gratitude to the courageous president of the United States for his intervention and putting peace to Middle East. So that is why it is a very important element of at least consultations, at least exchange of views, what might happen and how it might happen in this particular area. And looks like we are talking about hostages of different kinds, physical hostage or psychological hostages, people who are being manipulated. And this might be another example of at least influence, impact, on purposeful or inadvertent, but nevertheless, this looks like some impact on thinking and maybe decision-making process on the American side.
Yeah, I agree. It was shaping the narrative in the mind of the president. And it's possible the president has reconsidered it. Certainly, he's had bad conversations with President Putin since, but and maybe that affects his overall view, and that eventually will also affect the Iran question. And I think Iran's behavior will eventually create a reconsideration. But I think you're right. This was shaping a narrative in the president's mind that led to a strategic, I think, a premature strategic pullback by Israel
Okay,
states.
yeah. This one of the most successful, or maybe the most successful military security and psychological operation on the part of Israel, Rising Lion, that has been launched on June 13th and achieved in a very short period of time impressive results. But this operation did not achieve the final result, as we understand. So missile program has been halved, but not fully destroyed. As for nuclear program, at least according to the recent assessment reports, it looks like it has been delayed maybe for a year or a couple of years. But once again, even this program has not been obliterated, as this term has been used regularly. And what is most important, that the brain of this regime is still there. Brain in just in the person of Ayatollah and other Ayatollahs in the way of the regime itself. So that is why it can regenerate another head of this octopus. So what do you expect? What could happen now? Because it looks like nobody kind of stop pursue this policy. Nobody eliminated the program. So that is why it's maybe some delay, but threat is still there. What could happen now?
Well, the Israelis have already said that they've developed a military plan and will mow the lawn, essentially. Namely, they need to maintain full air control, not just superiority, control over Iran's airspace so that they can conduct periodic attacks like they do against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, against Iran, to ensure any movement toward a missile reconstitution or a nuclear reconstitution is instantly mowed down and brought down. But that's really a long-term, difficult strategy to maintain. I think at the end of the day, the Israelis know that they won't be able to do that, but it will probably provoke an Iranian response. And then the ceasefire is off, and then Israel can finish the war. So I think what you're seeing is the Israelis are going to try to mow the lawn, both by maintaining the air superiority and then periodically striking. But they expect that at one point to go for a resumption of the war. And when that happens, my sense is they will very quickly move to the ultimate resolution of it in their mind, which is to destroy the center of power, which is Khamenei himself. And his son, by the way, because his son is fully invested now in running the country. So if Khamenei is killed, his son is still there. So it's a pair. When we talk about decapitation, it would be both. But I think that's Israel's real strategy. Uh, and the warfare that Israel knows how to conduct, clearly it knows how to penetrate and shut down the capability of the Iranian regime to function. And in many ways, Israel reinvented warfare in this war. It wasn't just a great victory for Israel. I would imagine if I were sitting in Beijing right now, I'd be terrified. Because if the United States figured out how to do what Israel did, all these calculations of how many ships you have and how many airplanes you have and what sort of a large strategic force, the whole old correlation of forces argument or balance is gone. You can defeat an enemy far greater than yourself uh, within minutes, with such a strategy, if you know what you're doing and you know how to leverage human intelligence, artificial intelligence, penetration, combined with commandos, Air Force, all integrated into an operational structure. Very complex, very difficult, never been tried before, successfully done against Nasrallah and Hezbollah, and then cut and paste put onto Iran and successfully executed there. I would imagine that Beijing, for example, is sitting there terrified because this says that whatever calculations they make, whatever military they build, if America could do to them what Israel did to Iran, there's no war, there's no ability to win. So I think the Israelis have delivered this huge victory. The second thing is they can do it again. All the assets are there. They're probably growing each day because Israel is seen now to be far stronger and far more capable and confident than they were before the war. And that sort of confidence, capability, and power brings people to your side who want to hedge their bets, who want to be with the winners. Very important thing in the Middle East. So I think Israel will have more assets with each week as it goes on and able to do what they did to the Iranian regime even more effectively the next round.
It reminds me words of the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, who said probably soon after October 7th, 2023, that what Israel is going to do now is to change substantially, dramatically Middle East.
Yes.
And less than 2 years after he pronounced these words, we do see that the Middle East has changed dramatically. And it is not the end of these changes.
Correct.
And Israel, as you correctly mentioned, is emerging as a superpower, but is not old style superpower, with some elements of old style superpower, but with very substantial elements of new style superpower that we have not seen anything else any time before, because of this deepest intrusion into the enemy ranks of different kinds. It was effectiveness and the preciseness of their blows that we have not seen before. So that is why this term that I very much like, Majnun,
Yeah.
the big Majnun of Middle East. This can be called of this new type of warfare that is being used right now against enemies that by traditional measurement, much larger, much more powerful. But if you understand how to work with really critical elements of this enemy, you can achieve victory. This observation gives a lot of hope, a lot of support to many people around the world, not only in Israel, but around the world, for those people and for those nations, for those groups who are fighting for their freedom, for fighting for the liberation from interventions, aggression of totalitarian regimes and authoritarian regimes who are going to crush independence and real movement to the Western civilization from that. So it gives a lot of hope for many people around the world.
Agreed.
Um, we are covering a lot of very important topics. I hope that we can continue because we touched something, but we did not touch a lot that I wanted to touch and to talk to you. Before we conclude for this moment, could you tell something what we really missed, but you think it is absolutely necessary to say right now? Just our audience would know something very, very important.
Well, yes, it's a quickly put but a complex point, which is Israel. If you look at what the concept is of make America great, and there is a very popular, Americans want to be a great nation. They're not reconciled to being a weak nation. But America's also a tired nation. It's not tired as much as they want to turn inward because we have serious cultural, political differences and issues we have to deal with. But how do you reconcile greatness with retreat, which is what we have to call it? If you want to leave Europe, if you want to leave the Middle East, that's retreat. And you can have a ostrich politics, but just because the ostrich plants his head in the sand doesn't make the predator go away. The only way you bridge that gap is by powerful regional allies, whether it's Israel, Ukraine, or wherever, that you secure regions through allies who are the most powerful, but also civilizationally aligned with you. And that allows you to withdraw safely to some extent. But you then have to back them up. You can't undercut them in your withdrawal because your power, your residual position in the region depends on that. And it's important because the global structure, architecture of the world still rests on American power. So if America withdraws and doesn't replace it with these alliances, then the global structure of power collapses and we're in a world war. So it's critically important that that happens. The second part of that is that Israel isn't just another country. It is a civilizational foundation of the West. The United States looks at itself as the new Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem matters. The Judeo Christian civilizational roots of America matter. Europe is having a real problem remembering who it is and what it's coming from. And same with the United States. And you have people like Alexander Dugin and all those who say, oh, it's Christianity and you need to have Christianity. But their definition of Christianity is nothing but religious totalitarianism. It's not genuine Christianity. It's totalitarianism. It's what we saw in Justinian and Byzantium. It's not what the West is about. Um, so it's no solution what Alexander Dugin is offering. The answer is to return to the roots, the civilizational roots of the West. And Israel's victory here, in some ways, reaffirms and restores one of the core pillars of Western civilization and reinvigorates in the West an understanding that no, as a Judeo Christian civilization, we can survive and win, prevail, and actually that is the foundation. It's along with the pillars of Athens and Rome. Once those three pillars are reestablished, the Western civilization will stand stable and can win.
Definitely, there are several topics appeared for our future conversation, especially about New Jerusalem and about the roots and the development, evolution of Western civilization, and what would be the best ways to defend Western civilization, to preserve it, and to just to give a push for future developments of the nations belonging to these civilizations. Now, I would like to thank you, Dave, very much for this very enlightening conversation. Maybe we'll come back again to the Middle East and to what is going on the fronts of Iranian-Israeli war that did not stop yet. If in the best case it's a ceasefire, but as we read all this information every day, it does not look that it's a real ceasefire so far. So that is why waves of news would come, and we'll definitely will discuss that. So once again, thank you very much. We enjoyed conversation with David Wurmser, Senior Analyst for Centers of Security Policy, Washington. Thank you.